You can be turning to 1 Samuel 17. You can be praying for us too as soon as we finish here. I am dropping by and picking up the bombshell, and we are headed out to Arcade, New York. 8 hours away. I think we're going to try to go through Canada. I am scheduled to be at my granddaughter's soccer game on Friday. No, we hope to get there before Friday. That's the goal. But it's going to be one of those Congrove trips. I am 116 miles away from turning over 300,000 on the Traverse. It will happen before I get out of this country. We want it to. Believe me, we want it to. I want to begin this morning by making a comparison, if I can. Let me go ahead and get to my passage here. You've come upon now one of the great stories of the Old Testament. And to say that it's a story does not lessen its validity. It is, you know this from last year probably, that from Genesis really through Ezra, you have what is considered the great narrative of the Old Testament. And aside from the fact that it is true, which it is one of these stories that rivals anything else that's out there. I grew up, of course, with Jack and the Beanstalk, as you probably did. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I did a little research. That timeless tale first appeared in 1734, if my research is right, and it was called Jack and the Magic Beans. And while it was an amazing story, it presents parents like Deb and I with some moral dilemmas there. I mean, let's face it. I jotted down a few notes. In the giant's world, what does he do? He eludes the giant's grasp. Oh, by the way, he sells his cow for a new iPhone, so to speak. And then he eludes the giant, steals from the giant, runs away, slides down the beanstalk, and murders the giant just to save his own hide. Now, you never thought about it that way, did you? That's Jack and the Beanstalk. We much more preferred in our family, I don't know if you remember these, Pat Boone had a series out called Stories That Live. And they were real-life accounts of the biblical events that I think literally changed people's lives. We went all across the country, back and forth from Iowa to Arizona, back and forth, listening to stories that live. David, Daniel in the lion's den, Jesus' miraculous healing, they were all part of our road trip. The other thing was that I thought it was interesting. Now I'm going back into ancient history when we had things called cassette tapes. And the tape said, you will know when, Pat Boone said, you will know when to turn the page when you hear that ding. Excuse me, my voice is already gone. Ding. And so in effect, it helped our children learn to read, quite frankly. And we love those stories that live. But I want to come back now to the actual text. Oh, one other thing. In my mind, I have an indelible impression of this story. I still have this Bible that my grandmother gave me. I got to find it now. Hold on. My grandmother Brinker gave me this Bible December 25th, 1963. And I was, 6? And it had these wonderful, I know you can't see this well, but it had these wonderful paintings, pictures. And this one I have never forgotten. In other words, I'm 66 years old, and every time I think about David and Goliath, my mind goes back to this wonderful photograph, one painting, whatever. And I was going to try to use this Bible today. When I preached this at Lake Community, I forgot that it's the original King James, and it's got all kinds of words in that none of you have ever heard in 50 years. So I decided it wasn't even New King James, but that's what my grandma got me in '63. I would later come to Christ in 5 years from that. But this Bible still sits on my shelf, and it has wonderful memories for me. My point is these are the kind of stories that we ought to be telling our kids and our grandkids instead of giving them a subscription to Netflix. Now, my daughter, and I love her dearly, she's a millennial. She does have her kids now listening to Thomas the Train and Aunt Rachel or Miss Rachel, whatever. I never heard of these people. But my kids, I think, really matured in an interesting way through stories that live, because they were being told. They concentrated on their auditory senses, and they burrowed the truth of Scripture into their lives. So I don't think you can even get stories that live. I did see, on a side note, I did see an interview with Pat Boone from the Wall Street Journal, and he's still living. And he recounts, and I don't agree with everything, but Pat Boone was a little theologically down the road from me. But you know what? He took a beating in Hollywood because he wouldn't do certain things. And God still has him living, and he, in his work, influenced my kid's life. And for that I say amen. So the question is, how to slay a giant, okay? And I think if we are honest with ourselves, now there's a lot of text, I should say, for us, and we're not going to read through all this because you're probably pretty familiar with this story. So I don't need to do that. But we all have giants in our lives, right? We all have things that are big that we can't get over on our own, or we think we can't. So this is not just a story for kids. It is in the Scriptures. It is part of the inspired record. It is God's revelation for us, and it is true. And we need to think about that from a principled point. So I will again leave you with a couple of applications that I think are valuable. But this is good stuff. When fear, and here's my little theme, when fear rears its ugly head, and it does for all of us, biblical faith becomes our champion. Now, I have to have a discussion with Debbie. We have to schedule these now because we're both pretty busy. But I'm a little concerned about me as I get older. I seem to have more anxiety and irritation about things that are upcoming in my life. I never used to be that way. And I'm a little concerned about it. So, all of this is for me. And it thrills my heart, by the way, to hear that a pastor is still praying for you. Because when we assume the calling of pastor, and there's some folks that followed me in pastorates, that they didn't understand that when you sign on to loving people, okay? And you know what loving sheep is like, and you know what messed up pastors are like. I mean, we all have feet of clay, but I'm thankful that guy is still praying for you. I think that's neat. Now, I'm going to frame this discussion this morning because I have a friend who's a tree guy. So my friend is Ted Westerman, who used to be a firefighter with Jeff. Thank you. I had a moment. And when he retired from the fire service, he started a tree business. And on Fridays, I usually help him by splitting wood or helping him on a job. And I have picked up a couple of thoughts from my favorite tree guy. So, and by the way, Ted knows something about slaying giants. Some of these trees are just enormous, okay? And I thought, I got to thinking one day as I was recovering from my last injury there, that every week, you can't see it, but I got a big patch on my arm here because I have thin skin and I had a piece of wood come in and I'm bleeding all the way down my arm. And Ted says, yeah, you need to take care of that. And my wife says, what did you do? Anyway. So I'm going to present this in this framework of 3 issues, and we'll go back and forth in the text because it's just way too much here. First of all, I think we need to evaluate the potential for destruction. When you enter 1 Samuel 17, by the way, you will recognize at the end of 16, verse 23, so it came about whenever the evil spirit from God came to Saul, David would take the harp and play it with his hand, and Saul would be refreshed and be well. And we gave some reasons why we thought David had become so skillful at this. He just is a master, a combination of skill and giftedness that soothed Saul's weary soul. Now, at some point, if you read in what I call in the space between the chapters, apparently Saul's situation improved enough so that David could go back to the sheepfold. Now, I want you to stop and think about that very thing for a moment. He's been anointed king, heir apparent, if we'll put it that way. And how many leaders do you know who have been inaugurated for a position want to go back and mess with ugly, smelly sheep? But that's where he goes. And I think that's I think there's a principle there. I think there's something to be learned from that. To be never too good to do anything, and to recognize that timing belongs to God. So I want to suggest to you that David has gone back to the sheepfold. Now, that the author changes the scenario. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and they were camped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes Damnim. Don't say that too quickly. Verse 2, Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, within the valley between them. Then a champion came out, in other words, one representing each faction or each side, from the armies of the Philistine, named Goliath, from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. I've got somewhere in your notes here, but I'll jump down and simply mention that. He was likely about 9 foot 9 inches tall. His spearhead probably weighed 7 to 18 pounds, and he hauled around an armor on him of what scholars think is about 157 pounds. No small dude. The interesting thing is, you can go back to, if you want to, you can check this out a little bit. But I gather from Joshua 11:22 that he may be one of the remaining giants of the Anakim that Joshua talks about in chapter 11, verse 22. But he seems unbeatable. He had a bronze helmet, verse 5, on his head. He was clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had bronze greaves on his legs and bronze a javelin slung over his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield carrier walked before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said, "Why don't you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me." There's the challenge. I've made a little note in your notes that there's plenty of potential for destruction here. Alfred Edersheim suggests that the circumstances are grim and says unbelief makes cowards. and Saul and his army were content to take up defensive positions. There is not a person in the ranks of Israel that wants to go fight this dude. And Saul is, I think, already languishing in unbelief, and I think Edersheim is right. Unbelief makes cowards. If, verse 9, he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us. Again, the Philistines said, and here's one of those places you need to underline or think about. I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we might fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. They hadn't read the New Testament passage that we find in Hebrews, had they? I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. I know that's New Testament, but plenty of other examples. In other words, Saul is already reeling and walking backwards, so to speak. Saul is already operating on human ingenuity and human standards and is unprepared biblically to fight this battle. As we all are when we're up against something that's bigger than us, and the only tools we're wielding are the ones we have in our own stuff. So, first of all, the situation is grim. Secondly, the family is less than supportive, okay? Dad, of course, thinks that Jesse apparently thinks David is kind of the smaller of the group, the unimportant of the kids. Verse 12. Now David was the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem of Judah, whose name was Jesse, and he had 8 sons. And Jesse was old in the days of Saul, advanced in years among men. And the 3 older sons of Jesse had gone after Saul into the battle. And the names of these 3 sons who went into battle were Eliab, the firstborn. The second was Abinadab. And the third, Shammah. David was the youngest. Now, the 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his flock in Bethlehem. So as Saul improved emotionally and psychologically, David would go back and do his sheep thing, his sheep gig. Okay? So over the period of a month and a half, 40 days of 16, the Philistine came forward morning and evening for 40 days, took his stand. Then Jesse said to his son David, or to David his son, now take for your brothers an ephah of this roasted grain and these 10 loaves and run to camp of your brothers. Bring also 10 cuts of cheese. Interesting little comment. This is most likely a type of cream cheese. Where are the bagels? I don't know. Because you can't have cream cheese without bagels. Okay? All right. Take this stuff and check it. Look into the welfare of your brothers and bring back news of them. For Saul and they and the men of Israel are in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. Well, maybe we will go over most of the verses. Anyway, so David arose early in the morning, left the flock with a keeper, and took the supplies and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the circle of the camp while the army was going out in battle array, shouting the war cry. Okay? They got a lot of shout. They just don't have any volunteers. Did you ever think about that? We talk a great game, but where are the volunteers? You know, back in the days, I learned a great little principle. People would come to me with these ideas. We should do this, Pastor. We should do that. We should do that. And eventually, I got to the point of saying something like, yeah, we can do that with you and whoever else you want to take charge on that. Because It's one thing to spout and use rhetoric and all this kind of stuff. It's another thing to step up to the line. And in my case, just so you don't misunderstand, I usually had a lot of people, do that. Israel and the Philistines, 21, drew up in a battle array, army against army. Then David left his baggage in the care of his baggage keeper and ran to the battle line and entered in order to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, so he's done what his father asked him. He's in there, and all of a sudden he hears the environment. Here's what's going on. As he was talking with them, behold, the champion Philistine from Gath, named Goliath, was coming up from the army of the Philistines, and he spoke these same words, and David heard them. So David now gets firsthand knowledge of how the battle is going. When all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were greatly afraid. So you've got an incompetent leader in Saul. You've got a very huge opponent in Goliath. You've got a bunch of soldiers who are not interested at all in advancing. And then you have his brothers. The men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who is coming up? Surely he is coming up to defy Israel. And it will be that the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel." In other words, tax-free. Now there's some incentive for you. No taxes. You get the daughter and you get renown. Wow. They're just lining up for that one, aren't they? Then David, loved this. Then David spoke to the men. Remember what we talked about last week about David's skill set. Because remember, you can't just throw away the context of what we gathered last week. This wonderful skill set that God has entrusted to David. Okay? So that you got to keep that in mind. David spoke to the men who were standing by him, saying, oh, and one more comment. Again, remember, this all takes place in the environment where David is going back and forth to the sheep. It's not like Samuel anointed him and he's sitting around thinking about how great his future is going to be. No, he's gone back to the bakery. He's in the oil. Seriously. So you have to appreciate the environment. David is not sitting around on a pillow just waiting it all to fall to him. This skill set and these circumstances have created an environment where David understands God and understands what must be done. You don't get that way by accident. You don't wake up with wisdom that way. It's crafted. It's honed. Anyway. So when David spoke to the men, 26, who were standing with him, "What will be done to the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach of Israel?" Stop here, give you a little practical thought of mine, and this is just me. Wouldn't it be great, almost unbelievable, if there was a man out running for office now who would say, "I don't want to just make the country great again. I don't just want to increase the tax rolls. I want to take away God's reproach from this land." Now there's something to vote for. Man. One of my colleagues at the bakery is a 20-year-old young lady, one of about 7 kids, going to Grand Valley, taking a class that attempts to advance the transgender movement. Scheduled her to give a presentation to her classmates on the legitimacy of transgender movement. And I asked her, I said, "So what did you do?" She said, "I didn't show up." I said, "Yeah." Now, that may not be the best approach going forward, but really, this is what my tax dollars are going for at Grand Valley? Grand Valley was started some years ago with, I think, much more lucid ambitions, has now actually, Grand Valley has literally changed the emotion or the cultural landscape of Allendale. So I don't have all the answers for our country and our government, but I do like what will be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel. And I would long for the reproach to be removed and for us to be the kind of land that really loves God again. Verse, latter part of 26, for who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? Now that's some boldness. Again, he didn't get that from sitting on the pillow. God has been at work in this young man's life. People answered in accord with this, saying, thus it will be done to the man who kills him. Now, Eliab, the oldest brother, heard when he spoke to his men, and Eliab's anger. Maybe the word you ought to throw in there is jealousy. Methinks thou doth protest too much. Why have you come down, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Being that that's really where you belong. I know your insolence and wickedness of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the battle. Now, could his anger stem from his own jealousy? Somebody and I don't remember who it was, but said, to be great is to be misunderstood. And just as Jesus' family could not seem to understand their son the siblings' motivation or mission, neither could David's own brothers, I think, separate his own jealousy from David's boldness. In other words, he had the same desires to be bold, but he didn't have the machinery internally, if that makes sense. Boldness doesn't come from without. I think it comes from within. And you don't have to be 6'6" or 9'9". Now, the other thing I want you to notice here, look at David's reaction. It is firm, but it is without retaliation. Look at this text. Where'd it go? Verse 29. But David said, what have I done now? Was it not just a question? In other words, why are you getting so angry? I'm simply proposing a solution and charging my fellow citizens. Now, there's no retaliation. He doesn't say, well, you're a real jerk, Eliab. I mean, I would have maybe said, you need slapped. He doesn't do any of that. But nor does he agree with the assessment of his brother. I've learned over the years, and it's hard for me, because sometimes I really get irritated and I want to respond. And I'm over there at the counter the same. What are you talking about, Deb says. Well, I want to slap somebody. And, I have learned through other people that sometimes you state your case and you simply move on, and you don't fix stupid sometimes. Sometimes you just can't fix stupid. Okay? Or jealousy or bitterness. Right? Right? Am I right? Okay? So, verse 30, then he turned away from him to another and said the same thing, and the people answered the same thing as before. They're all on board, with the exception maybe of Eliab, but no takers. But somebody has been listening. Verse 31, when the words which David spoke were heard, they told them to Saul, and they sent for him. Now, this leads me to the second thing that Ted inadvertently. He's going to want part of my honorarium. He's not going to get it. Well, I'll buy him dinner. Maybe we'll do that. This leads me to the second thing that a tree man knows. You always take inventory of your resources. What do I have in the truck? What do I have in my car? What do I have in the trunk that I can use to take this tree down? Well, in David's case, he has a number of things. Look at them. Number one, and I've kind of talked through this now the whole way. He has a character forged in anonymity. And I think that anonymity is much better for the believer than public acclaim. He has a character that has been forged through anonymity, but powerful in presence. And I think those times returning to the sheepfold between working with Saul and being with the sheep have tempered him and given him an understanding of life and of circumstances and of character. Now, I've said this to you before, and I probably made the mistake of saying it to my students again, but I told them again that I think they should all have to serve either in the military or the Peace Corps, where they have to do something they don't like for somebody they can't stand and they can't get out of it. And because there's something valuable to that. Okay? I tried quitting in the Army and they wouldn't let me. Drove into Fort Dix, New Jersey for basic training, and I realized by then I had made a huge mistake, and they wouldn't let me go home. Took all my clothes, put them in a closet. So there's something in that sheepfold that is valuable. Now let me go a little further by way of application. It isn't in your notes. I think some of the most valuable time spiritually that you will ever spend will be in solitude between you and your God, meditating on the Scriptures and thinking deeply about the person of God. Don't you? I'm looking for a little agreement here. Thank you. You get a free donut. Come by the bakery. See, it's that meditation, it's that solitude, it's that looking constantly at creation, it's all of that. It's that develops the character of the person. All right, I could say more, but that leads me to number two. The second piece of, I think, of his resources is a confidence achieved over time from walking with God. This confrontation I've suggested is almost, otherworldly. I mean, it's just so, visual. One author has described the scene as something one breathes from another atmosphere. I mean, you don't come upon this situation that often. It's so ripe with emotion and stress and remarkable kind of circumstances. All right, so I think there's a confidence here, not an arrogance, a confidence. It's a difference. There's this character that has been forged in anonymity, and there is this confidence that comes from an experience of walking with God. Now, back to the text. Verse 31, when the words which David spoke were heard, and they were told them to Saul, and he sent for him. David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant, I love this, I'm stepping up, I'm volunteering. I'm here. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. Then Saul said to David, you are not able to go up against the Philistine to fight with him. You are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth. Now, this is the guy who's been ministering to Saul's bad side. Let's just say it that way. And you see what I mean about confidence. He's not afraid to talk to the superior in a way that's respectful but direct. I like that. He's got what I call moxie. With all due respect, well, he didn't say that, but David said to Saul, your servant, in a way he does, with all due respect, your servant was tending his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear, and by the way, a lion and a bear in the Old Testament is significant of, in other words, that means something. That suggests that they are very competent foes. They are, in the animal kingdom, they are the ones. If you can do battle well with a lion and a bear, you're doing well. Okay? The lion and the bear came and took a lamb from the flock, and I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from their mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by the beard and struck and killed him. Now, I want to tell you something. That's, to me, he gets my vote. Did you ever watch these animal shows? Who was it? He's gone now, but his son is taken up. He's an Australian. And he'd go out and grab the crocodile by the chompers. I'm thinking, why? He wades into the bayou or the Everglades or wherever he's at in Africa and just grabs one guy grabs the tail, that's the end I want to be on, and the other guy grabs the mouth. So David said, I grabbed him by the beard. So it's not, when you begin to think this is far-fetched, like too good to be true, dial that back, reel that back in, and realize that what you're reading is the revelation from God, and he wants it that way. Okay? It's pretty significant. David is no slouch. When he, struck and killed in 36. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. There it comes again. I think that's the second time he said that. This is otherworldly. This is not merely David against Goliath. This is David against that which has positioned itself against the living God. Let's not forget that. Otherwise, we get lost in rocks and spears and all that kind of stuff. And I'll get to that in a minute. 37, David said, the Lord who delivered me, here it is, from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And that's all Saul needed to hear, because as little as he thinks David is, he doesn't want to do anything near what David has said he would do. Who was it? I forget the first commander of Lincoln's army in the Civil War. What was that guy's name? He was great in getting the army ready. I can't remember his name. But he wouldn't fight. McClellan. Yes. You are wonderful. General George McClellan? It doesn't matter. McClellan. He was great for getting him ready for parades, but he wouldn't fight. And month after month after month went by, wouldn't fight. Finally, Lincoln says, in one of Lincoln's great comments, he writes a letter to McClellan and says, I'd like to borrow the army if you're not borrowing it, if you're not using it. That's great. Well, that's kind of, they've been sitting here. How long? How long they've been sitting here? Little retention exercise here. How long they've been doing this? 40 days, 6 weeks. Okay? All right, got to get going. Now, interesting here, verse 38. Maybe I should pick up, I guess you can read through the rest of this. His spiritual life suggesting a regular interaction. Is it hubris or an authentic relationship with God that can make such claims as these? I'm suggesting the latter. Interesting comment from a Bible called the Burlberger Bible that he must know that he is not to do with men, but with God. With a living God, he will have to do, and not with an idol. Kyle makes that comment. In other words, there's a very clear differentiation here that Goliath is not just messing with men, he's messing with God. And I think that's an important distinction to make. And this will keep you straight in your theology, I think. The difficulties we are having in this country, it isn't really Republican, Democrat, Independent. It's really godliness against God. Keep that straight, and you'll be better off. My job as a minister of the gospel is not to fight against Republicans and Democrats or independents. My responsibility is to advocate for the living God against sin. That's my job. Now, I'm all in favor, and I love Mr. Heisinger, who's a representative in my little part of the world. But this is my job. Now, and I think I need to go back here a little bit before I'm getting ahead of myself. He has a skill set that's achieved through experience with God. Leadership, navigating roles associated with home and court life. How many do you know that can handle the lack of the press? Where's the camera? I had a friend once who used to be a Christian artist, singer, and he told me what it was like to go to these Christian music concerts and these conferences. He said everybody, when they come up to shake your hand, is always looking around to see if somebody more important over there. Interesting. So there's this leadership. And before I leave this, I have to mention his marksmanship. Judges chapter 20, would you? Quickly. Judges 20, verse 16. Interesting statement in Judges 20, 16. Maybe I'll back up to, let's see here. Let's see. Yeah, let's back up to 15 from this. This is Judges 20, 15. From the cities on that day, the sons of Benjamin were numbered 26,000 men who draw the sword, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah, who were numbered 700 choice men. And then verse 16, out of these people, 700 choice men, whoever's left-handed here, this is your verse, okay? 700 choice men were left-handed. Now look at this. Each one could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Isn't that cool? I mean, I'm lucky if I hit the target with a shotgun, okay? They could sling a stone, keep this in mind. So to be superior at this kind of marksmanship means, and again, I don't think it's hyperbole. I don't think it's exaggeration. This is the word of God. They were excellent marksmen. So you go back to the text. I want you to see that. That's going for him. He may, according to Kyle, in the exercise of his shepherd's calling, he may have become so skillful in the use of his sling that, like the Benjaminites mentioned in 2016, he could sling at a hair's breadth and not miss. And I suggested he has what John Wayne, if you ever watched True Grit, what the gal said. She says, I like Rooster Cogburn because he has grit. And I don't know how to define that. It's a toughness necessary to care for those lives, the animals, in his charge against those predators who would do harm. And all good pastors want to care for their flock against others outside and maybe even in who would want to do them harm. That's why the shepherd is an excellent training ground. All right, third thing from Ted. The first cut, Matt, and I really learned this. I learned something because I watched this guy, and he got this 100-foot tree, and he said, well, I can drop it right over there. And I'm thinking, uh-huh. And he makes this little cut in this one spot, exactly where it's supposed to. Puts his bucket on his tractor up against it, and then takes the saw and goes through it. And I have watched this on more than one occasion. Drops it exactly where he wants it. The homeowner next door is going, drops it right there. But you know me, because I'm not him, and I do things more erratically, which is why I have injuries. I just go up and start cutting. This will work. And so the first cut, the first shot, the first move, the first words out of our mouth, the first thought, the first action needs to be well thought out. Okay. By the way, Saul's first, this is interesting, verse 38, then Saul clothed David with his garments and put a bronze helmet on his head. What do you do if you're worldly or if you're carnal and you want to win a battle? You go back to what you always know. And in Saul's world, more is better, right? In Saul's world, heavy armor is better than less armor, right? That's the way the unbeliever thinks. That's the way the carnal believer thinks. I need more. I mean, it's all up to me. So really, Saul is simply reverting back to the way Saul has always thought. Carnally, or pagan, as a pagan. Okay? So I think I don't know if I even noted that, but it just occurred to me. Then Saul clothed David with his garments, put a bronze helmet on his head, which this must have been hilarious, and he clothed them with armor. David girded his sword over his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tried them or tested them. So David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. Okay, make the first cut is important. My first statement, you need to understand, the goal here is that the stone might find the sweet spot. Now, don't get lost in the stone or the wind or the direction or the strength that David, launches this thing. The emphasis is not the stones nor their placement, but the trust in God that He, that is God, will do what we or He cannot do. Folks, He could have took him down with my Daisy BB gun. And I'm deadly serious. Because this isn't about armament. It's about God's dunamis, His power. Right? This isn't about a sling. And, now my question is, here's my question for God someday. Why 5 stones if all it took was 1? I don't know. Isn't it great to hear a pastor say he doesn't know? I don't know. I don't know. For those of you that think I know everything, forget it. Okay? Debbie will ask me, I don't know. I've been thinking about this, Mark. I don't know, but look at this. David took them off. He took his stick in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones. By the way, if you know, I'm all ears. 5 smooth stones. Why smooth? Fly easier, I don't know, from the brook, and put them in his shepherd's bag, in which he had even in his pouch, and sling in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Philistine, I've got to really hurry. Philistine came on and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked at David, he disdained him, probably swore at him, cussed at him, for he was but a youth. He was ruddy with a handsome appearance. He did note that. Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? It's a effective cursing or diminishing his character. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Philistine also said, come to me and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. And oh my word, that must, if you weren't given to fear before, maybe you are now. David said to the Philistine, 40 come to me with a sword, spear, and a javelin, but I love this. I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all, look at this, that all the earth may know that I am a sharpshooter. Is that what it says? That I can sling a sling, or that I am a tough guy. The earth may know that there is a God in Israel. I'll stop here and make another comment. Part of the whole task, in other words, if you go back to the book of Judges, you will recognize that the task of Israel in that period of time was to make God known. And their little interactions with the Philistines could never, in my mind, garnish enough traction, because it was this cyclical pattern of relief and enjoyment of God and sin and curse and blessing, and it just kept going. And so the whole goal of the time of the judges really was for these judges to elevate the name of God and stick it to the Philistines, who were godless. See? So that's why, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all the assembly may know now that he does not deliver by sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into their hands. Then it happened, when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet the Philistine. If I could see that, it would be wonderful. And David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it. And guess what? It was true, it was powerful, and it could have been a BB gun, but it leveled this dude. Praise his name. Right? Now just imagine what that was like. David prevailed, verse 50. Oh, I should mention again, the stone, and he slung it, and it struck the Philistine on his forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead, so that he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. And David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. The men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the valley and the gates of Ekron. And the slain Philistines lay along the way to Sherem, even to Gath and to Ekron. The sons of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines and plundered their camps. Then David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his weapons in his tent. One last scene before I leave you. I call this after the fact. A lot of people want to throw some stones at this encounter here. Now, when Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this young man?" And Abner said, "By your life, O king, I do not know." The king said, "You should inquire who the son of this youth is, or whose son this youth is." The issue, as I have tried to point out, in my opinion, is not so much that Saul has never heard of him, but he wants to know about his family. If you'll notice in my notes under after the fact, 1755, it is not the name of David's father alone that he wanted to discover. That was part of what he wanted to know. But what kind of man the father of a youth who possessed the courage to accomplish so marvelous a heroic deed really was. Are there any more like you at home? It is an interesting question. And the question was put not merely in order that he might grant him an exemption from his house, from taxes, as the reward promised for the conquest of Goliath, but also in all probability that he might attach such a man to the court, since he inferred from the courage and bravery of a son the existence of similar qualities in his father. And I want to conclude by suggesting to you this is a turning point for David, as you can expect that it would be. A turning point for good things and a turning point for bad things. For if you go into the next chapter, you'll find that you only have to go 10 verses before it all starts to go south for David, at least in his relationship with Saul. Because that kind of name recognition and that kind of greatness and that kind of boldness, for those who are not seeing things carefully, can be misunderstood, and we develop envy and jealousy. It now opened up, I've suggested, a path to the throne. From now on, or while he would return home to inquire of his family, his days of watching smelly sheep are probably over. Now he's going to be watching smelly people, so to speak. One last thought, and then I leave you with three applications. All of that experience that David has gleaned from watching Saul do government, I think we're going to help David eventually. But this is one of those majestic times in David's life, and we need to remember those, especially when we will encounter those times in David's life where we say, how could you do something so dumb? Welcome to the human race, folks. Leave you with three applications and we'll quit. Number one, I'm on this road still. So, as I've told you before, I've not arrived. I'm still under construction. But learning the fundamentals of a walk with God is never a wasted effort. Those days in the sheepfold were some of the most instructive and valuable in David's life. And I need to make sure in my life I don't get so busy I lose sight of what God wants me to learn in solitude. Billy Graham, I remind you, what would you do different? I would study more, preach less. Makes sense. Hard to do. Number two, listening to your inner calling is part of preparation for spiritual work. Now, I don't mean by this that we always should simply do what ourselves tell us to do. But what I am saying is we have an inner calling. 2 Peter says we have taken on a spiritual nature. Okay? We have the mind of Christ, Paul says. So at some point, God has begun to carve out in our lives a little bastion of righteousness. See? Now in Paul's case, he was exactly right. That bastion of righteousness is always going to fight against those little remnants that still remain. Remember the guy Jesus says, do you believe what I said? I think he healed his son. This is one of my favorite guys in the New Testament. Do you believe that he had just healed this guy's son, I think? And the guy says, I do believe, but help my unbelief. In all of our lives, there are little bastions, little outposts that are yet unconverted, we'll say, undefeated. And so the goal in our inner calling is to develop a confidence that isn't based on our own stuff, but on what God is doing in our lives. And by the way, he hasn't stopped when you turn 60 or 70. Does that make sense? At this point, if it doesn't, say, it don't make sense. So I've got these little outposts that sometimes are unspiritual, ungodly, and they are at war. Romans 7, by the way. They are at war with the good guys. I'm just telling you, that's how it is. And woman came to me one time, I told you this probably. She says, I just want you to know, Pastor, I don't sin anymore. This was at Robinson. And I spent the next half hour convincing her that she did. Thirdly, leading with the absence of self is a motivation that God honors. If you can If you can learn to lead without self, you are an extremely valued commodity. It is so difficult to separate our own selves, our own selfishness, our own egos from what we believe is best. And that's why we all need people in our lives who can tell us our stuff stinks. I have one. Her name's Debbie. You're full of baloney. She actually has had the guts to tell me sometimes that my comments there, I'm insincere. Can you believe that? Been married to the woman for 45 years, and she tells me I'm trying to pull the wool over her eyes. Can you believe that? But we need that. So I really believe, and I want you, if you get nothing else, these three applications seem to be relevant to me. And for any church, any point, anybody, any calling, mine included. Leading with the absence of self. And it's hard because everywhere around me, self and self-motivation and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and being great is celebrated. Who wants a pastor that didn't aspire to a church of 2,000? That's the world I dealt with. And that's why I quit going to pastors' conferences. I was so tired of watching other people talk about their big churches. And I was sitting back at Robinson with a church of 200. So all I'm saying, it's a real thing in ministry too, as you probably know.